Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. This is the International Mountain section of the Society for Range Management, our winter webinar series that we're doing this year. This is our second webinar of the series so far. We had a really good first webinar talking about virtual fencing technology. If you'd like to look at any of the past webinars, we are posting them on our website, which is ims.rangelands.org. You can head on over there and look at the full schedule for future webinars. Our next webinar is going to be on March 17th, which is a Friday, and that'll be at noon. We'll be hearing from a University of Alberta graduate student talking about some of the things they are doing up there. My name is Noah Davis, and I'll just be here for a minute, then we will get into the presentation itself. So thanks again, taking time out of your Wednesday evening. A couple housekeeping things just before we get started. Please mute yourselves during the talk just so we don't hear each other, and you can unmute yourselves at the end. We'll have time for questions. Just save them up to the end, and at the end of the talk you can either type your question into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and our speaker will answer your questions. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. We have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Tim DelCurto with Montana State University. He is the Nancy Cameron Chair and Professor of Animal and Range Science at Montana State in Bozeman. Before coming to MSU, he was a professor at Oregon State University based out of Eastern Oregon and did a lot of research there on beef cattle and nutrition. Prior to that, he was in Kansas. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Tim DelCurto, and we will hear what he has to say.
All right. Thanks, Noah. And I guess thank you to this group for inviting me. Anytime I get a chance to talk about our research or just the concepts of research, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. Tonight, in all honesty, I'm going to give you sort of a 30,000-foot overview of one of our big research thrusts here at Montana State University, and that's just beef production strategies that optimize the use of fall and winter rangelands. You know, as a way of introduction, okay, no, there we go. You know, you look at a map of the United States and you look at the western region, everything there in brown is rangelands greater than 1,000 meters. And so you look at the western U.S., most of it is at least 1,000 meters or you know, over 3,000 foot elevation. The only exceptions would be, you know, Central Valley, California, the Willamette Valley of Oregon, Columbia Basin. And if you know much about those regions, they're really not beef cattle regions. They're typically farming and wheat. So most of the western U.S., you look at our cattle production systems, they're kind of tied to these high elevation, challenging topography rangelands. You know, so why am I bringing this out? Well, it means our production systems actually are quite different than other areas of the U.S. We're typically faced with, you know, Montana, for instance, is a state that the growing season for forages is roughly 90 to 120 days, depending on where you're at. But unfortunately, we look at this next map. The other unique feature of the West is we're you know, arid to semi-arid rangelands. So typically less than 20 inches or less than 50 centimeters of precip. And so not only is our growing season short because of high elevation, the forage is typically senesced prior to the end of the growing season because we just lack moisture. So it's a challenging area to have beef production systems, and it's one that, in all honesty, historically has really been challenged with limited nutrients and, in some cases, limited forage availability. So when you look at the lands and the forage resources in the Western U.S., you have to recognize that we do have forage resources, but they're limited in nutritional value and highly variable in terms of quantity. I was just glancing at some information sitting on my desk here that also said that our hay stocks in the last couple of years are the lowest they've been since the 1950s. So we have beef production systems that are dealing with limited nutrition resources, relatively short growing seasons, in an environment where we have to select cattle that sort of fit these kinds of resources. So when I was hired at Montana State University, I guess I should be 7 years ago this spring, one of the first things that became very apparent to us was that we need to come up with a research program that addressed issues that were important to the state of Montana. And so as we approached this, one of the things we really felt confident in, and I'm seeing it all over the West, is there's increased use of fall and winter grazing. In other words, how do we extend our grazing period, and in doing so, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, harvested hays, and things like that. Regardless of your political beliefs, the use of fossil fuels is going to be challenging down the road. I think just the cost of diesel, the cost of doing business is making a lot of ranchers want to look at alternatives, and certainly extended grazing seasons, things like that, make a lot of sense. The other challenge that we often don't talk about, a whole lot, but it's been around the ag industries forever, is labor has always been a challenge for us. So as you move away from hay all summer, feed it all winter kind of scenario, we're actually looking at sort of beef production systems that probably require less labor. It's an economical alternative to harvested forages. If you look at the price of forages right now, across the West, it's really difficult to pencil out. We've had a series of droughts really over the last 10 years that have affected forage availability and cost. And so anything we can do that's an alternative to harvested hays, I think we're doing a good thing. The other thing I want you to kind of think about, and part of our rationale for spending a lot of time and effort at fall and winter grazing is we think that from a whole systems perspective, increasing the use of rangelands outside the active growing season, is actually quite beneficial. Bunchgrass in particular, like Idaho fescue, blue bunch wheatgrass, needle and thread, squirreltail, those plants typically are not particularly tolerant of defoliation, particularly during the growing season, around that mid-boot stage where harvest, and then that plant tries to reestablish photosynthetic material, and sometimes at the cost of root production. So using these forage bases outside the growing season, actually from a long-term perspective, could be beneficial. The other thing that I think that's often not talked about, there's some literature out there that suggests this, but when we keep cattle grazing, or as ranchers would refer, we keep them in their working clothes, keep them out of confinement, we typically see some kind of indirect physiological benefits. People that graze their cows 10, 11 months out of the year, their cattle are typically in better physical shape, not necessarily better condition, but better physical shape, often have less problems with calving and things like that. But always remember, if we're using fall and winter forages, and we're typically in a scenario where we're using a senesced, high fiber, low quality forage. And so that's a forage that's a little tricky to use, and one that we have to think about, how to strategically supplement that to get the best use. Also, when we start thinking about these sorts of production systems, we also need to start thinking about how do we select cattle to fit this limited nutrition environment. And, not all cattle are alike. And we oftentimes, some of our challenges is we select cattle with production potentials that are greater than the nutritional environment we have. And then lastly, with our research program, we're looking at a lot of new technologies and things like that. And Dr. Sam Weifels, I think, will be talking to this group sometime in April, and he will talk in a lot more detail about this. But we've actually really benefited by using some new technologies to address questions that in the past we haven't been able to address very well. And so I'll touch on those, and Sam will in April talk about these in much more detail. For me, you always hear people say that if you do something that you really enjoy doing, you never have to go to work. Well, that's kind of the way I feel about doing beef cattle research, particularly on rangelands. When I look at these animals, I think they're some of the most fascinating animals in the world, and in part because these animals can use low quality, high fiber roughages. And in fact, they were designed to do that. And one of my pet peeves, and quite frankly, in the last few years, is all the verbiage in popular press about, the ranching industry contributing to climate change. I'm like I said, I don't want to get into politics, but I would tell you that if you know much about ruminant ecology, this really shouldn't even be something that's debated a lot. And my rationale for saying that is the most dominant carbohydrate on the planet, cellulose. And that cellulose is found in the form of plant biomass, and particularly the structural components of plants. Ruminants, and that's all ruminants, wild and domestic, have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to utilize these low quality forages and forages as a whole. And so I would contend that ruminants really have an ecological niche, regardless of the human population, and their role in particularly, really the processing and use of cellulose is part of our ecosystem. And so something that we really need to think about. Obviously, the real advantage of ruminants, and I think when you think about winter nutrition and extending grazing, you're really talking about how to optimize microbial population and the symbiosis of microbes with ruminant animals. And, I would argue, and we always hear this, like, well, pigs and chickens are more efficient. Well, they may be more efficient on grain, converting corn or soybeans 2 pounds of protein, but I would contend ruminant animals are most efficient on the planet. And, I'm bullish on the future of ruminants in terms of animal protein systems. I think they're important. They're needed ecologically to utilize cellulose. If you didn't have ruminant animals, one thing I want you to think about is what's the fate of cellulose. It's either going to burn or be metabolized by bacteria, but all those are going to be similar to the metabolism that a ruminant animal will do. I do feel strongly, though, as we look to the future, we're going to be looking at beef production systems that are less reliant on harvested feeds. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that's the direction we're headed. For me personally, when I look at all the different ruminant animals, and what I've done here in this figure is just listed North America ruminant animals, going from selective grazers to intermediate grazers with bighorn sheep, domestic sheep, elk, antelope, to the bulk grazers. And the ones I really want to kind of draw your attention to is the bulk grazers. These are animals that consume predominantly grass. Oftentimes we'll select not just portions of plant, but whole plants. In terms of their rumen reticulum, is actually makes up 20 to 30% of their of that animal's body weight. So if you think about a beef cow, if we're talking about 1,000-pound beef cow, somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds of that beef cow is that rumen and reticulum, the first two portions, rumen and stomach, plus content. And that's what makes them unique. These animals only have 2, perhaps 3 grazing bouts a day. They spend a high proportion of the day ruminating. And in fact, as a rule of thumb for beef cattle, it's roughly 8 hours grazing, 8 hours resting, and 8 hours ruminating. But it varies a bit depending on forage type. The lower the quality, the higher the fiber of the forage, the longer time spent ruminating. These animals actually have a high tolerance to fiber, and in fact will seek out grasses even when the forbs and shrubs have higher quality than grasses. And, finally, the reason why, bison are as big as they are and have the big, Springer ribs and big bodies, and same thing with cattle, is to accommodate, this fill and the retention time. When an animal eats grass, it's going to stay in that rumen reticulum anywhere from 36 to 96 hours, depending on the amount of fiber and the quality of forage. So very remarkable animals, honestly designed for consumption of grass year round. Okay? And so, I think trying to find systems to optimize the use of low quality forages fit right into these animals and what they're capable of. There's a lot of things we could probably talk about. I'm going to focus on strategic supplementation and how to use these low quality forages in beef production systems. And I would tell you the goal number 1 is minimize the use of supplements, which seems like a funny thing to say. But, a lot of times as I travel around and consult with various producers, I run into a lot of them that go, well, I just started feeding, 10 pounds of alfalfa just in case they needed it. Well, I would tell you, why don't you test your forage, kind of assess, either the low quality hay or the range land that you have and determine whether or not you need supplemental protein. Other things that you might want to consider is this is just a graph that sort of shows beef cattle requirements. So over here on the y-axis, just nutrient requirements of the cow. And it could be, expressed as energy, TDN, or protein. And when you think about a beef cattle or a beef cow, they have baseline maintenance requirements, which is kind of here in the blue area. And then we have what's referred to as gestational requirements. So right here, where my little pointer's at, would be conception. And as that fetus grows throughout the 284-day gestation length, the fetal demands increased, and with roughly 60% of those gestational needs and gestational growth, fetal growth, happening in the last trimester. When the most important aspect of beef cattle nutrient requirements is, quite frankly, coincides with calving. When that cow gives birth, its nutrient requirements increase dramatically, all the way up here to about peak lactation, which is roughly 60 to 70 days post-calving. The 2 bars here, just to bring your attention to, this upper bar is a cow with moderate milk production, perhaps 20 pounds of milk per day. This lower bar would be the same size cow, but with lower milk production, 10 pounds per head per day. So I think what I'm trying to illustrate to you is one way to control the amount of supplemental inputs you need is when you choose to calve and what level of milk that you have in your cows. If you want to reduce supplemental needs, you'll move this calving season. Here, the example we give is March, roughly. If you moved it to perhaps mid-April, 1st of May, this nutritional curve would probably, closely mirror what your range forage nutritional curve is going to look like. So the timing of calving and the level of milk that you're asking of these cows become really, really important in terms of supplemental needs. So just things I think you need to think of from the cow side and your management side that then relates to supplemental inputs. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the importance of protein and energy. And what I'm really going to get at is really when I think about managing beef cattle on winter rangelands, in all honesty, my first thought is meet their protein needs. And I think, in fact, I'm going to show you a couple studies that really illustrates this well. And it doesn't mean that trace minerals and vitamins, things like that, might not be deficient, but you can provide those, in a trace mineral salt or part of a package with protein supplement. But really meeting the protein needs of that cow becomes paramount. And to kind of show this, you guys are probably wondering why this guy's got, white hair and all that. It's because I've been around for a while. This was actually part of my PhD research. It was using stockpiled tallgrass prairie forage, which was quite frankly not very good, 3.4% crude protein and about 80% NDF. And for this study, we looked at feeding this low quality warm season grass to a bunch of cannulated animals where we had 4 treatments: a control or non-supplemented group, a group that received a 13% crude protein supplement fed at 0.5% of body weight, a 26% supplement fed at the same level, and a 39% supplement. 0.5% of body weight, a good way of describing this would be a 1,000-pound cow getting 5 pounds of supplement. We used, in these supplement compositions, we used sorghum grain and soybean. And the reason why we did that is sorghum grain is roughly about 10% crude protein, and soybean meal is roughly about 50% crude protein. So these supplements, that they only differed in the proportion of sorghum versus soybean meal. It also turns out that sorghum and soybean meal have the exact same caloric density. So by doing this, we're feeding 3 different levels of protein, but holding the energy content the same. So it's one way of looking at supplemental protein needs. For this study, I'm just going to show you really just one slide. But here with this low quality forage based diet, the control animals only ate 1.5% of their body weight. And again, a way to kind of explain what this would mean in terms like a mature cow. A 1,000-pound cow then would be eating roughly 15 pounds. The reality is that cow would not be doing well at all, would likely starve and over time, and certainly lose a lot of body condition. When we added the 0.5% of body weight of the 13%, predominantly sorghum, but a little bit of soybean meal in it, we actually saw a slight depression in forage intake, but then you add the 0.5 units on the total intake, and we got it up to roughly about 1.8, 1.9% of body weight total intake. And so actually it really didn't encourage forage intake at all. It actually depressed it. When we went to the 26%, which is about half soybean meal and half sorghum, all of a sudden we stimulated forage intake to 2.1%. And when we added the supplement on top of that, we got intakes now up to about 2.6% of body weight. So a 1,000-pound cow, we'd be talking about 26 pounds of dry matter. On an as-is basis, be like 30 pounds of hay. Most people in Montana don't have a 1,000-pound cow. They have probably a 12 or 1,300-pound cow. And so this would be in the neighborhood of 35, 40 pounds. This cow is going to make it. It's going to do well in the winter. And it's just a question of the amount of protein we got in there. When we went from 26 to 39, you can see we really didn't see much of a benefit. One of the things I want to come back and just highlight real quick, the reason why we think we got a depression of forage intake with this predominantly grain supplement, 13% supplement, is right down here at the bottom where we look at NDF digestion. For this treatment, this 13%, NDF digestion was actually depressed, which means when you add grain or starchy substance to animals eating a high fiber forage diet, you get a depression of intake. Another study that we did quite a while ago, but it's kind of one of those projects that I really liked, and I think it illustrates the importance of protein and also the importance of winter environment, was just a study I did when I was at Oregon State with Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center and their Northern Great Basin Experimental Range. With winter grazing cows, we just looked at increasing levels of supplemental alfalfa. And here our treatments were again a control or non-supplement cow, a group that received 1.5 kilograms of alfalfa hay a day, 3 kilograms of alfalfa hay a day, or 4.5 kilograms. If metrics isn't your thing, this is actually roughly 3 1/3 pounds, 6 2/3, and 10 pounds for our treatment floor. And so it kind of ran the range of what we saw producers in that area feeding. We just wanted to see, well, what's kind of the best fit for these forage conditions. For most of our studies, and the studies that Dr. Weifels talked about in April, we actually prefer to do 2-year studies, just because contrary to what people tell you, there's no such thing as a normal year. And every winter is different, and in some cases, the needs of these cows sort of reflect the variation of weather. This year, for instance, think of the weather we've had just in the last couple of days. Pretty challenging on cows and affects their nutrient needs. The way we did this study is we had them on 2,000-acre pastures. We gathered them daily. We fed them their individual supplements, and their colored ear tags told us if they're high, moderate, or low. And we fed them daily, and then we'd go back to the station and weigh up another. And for year 1, we had 112 cows. In year 2, I think we had 86. But pretty labor-intensive, challenging kind of study. The other thing we did is we looked at quality of diets selected in this winter environment using esophageal steers. These are just steers that have a surgical hole in their esophagus. We'd pull a plug, put honestly a bag around their neck and collect what they eat for 20-minute grazing bouts. Using this technique in year 1, we started out the winter period almost 7% crude protein, dropped to 6.26 by January, and by mid-February it's 5.43. The cattle were in the same 2,000-acre pasture the entire time. So a lot of this drop was to be expected, as cows typically took, their favorite feeds first, and it declined over time. NDF's relatively high here, but part of this is expressed on an organic matter basis. And the reason why we repeat studies over a course of 2 years is year 2 is very different. Year 1 was very mild, very nice year outside Burns, Oregon. Year 2 was bitter cold. And we had Arctic systems, multiple Arctic systems that came in and lasted, in some cases, 2 to 4 weeks. In the exact same pasture as year 1, our forage base with esophageal diets was less than 5 in December. It jumped up a little bit here in January, but that was because we actually had to move to a new pasture because we ran out of feed. And you'll understand here in a minute why we didn't take diet collections in February. In terms of just beef cattle performance, if you look at initial weights, our research herd at Oregon State, actually some desert cows, relatively small, not much bigger than 1,000 pounds. And the body condition going into the study was actually fairly good, averaging, somewhere from about 5.26 to 5.4 across the treatment groups. Over a 112-day winter feeding period, our control cows lost 66 pounds of body weight and 1.21 units of body condition. To be honest, this is the 3rd trimester. You really don't want to see them losing weight, but they did. For some people, they would say this is acceptable. For me, I wouldn't think so. But I think the thing I want you to really see here in this data is by just giving these cows, if you go from control to the low treatment group, by giving them, 1.5 kilograms a day, or 3 1/3 pounds, you get roughly a 78-pound weight gain advantage. And these animals, we spared a whole unit of body condition. And this is almost a 2-to-1 response for supplement offered versus body weight gain. As you go from the low to the moderate, you can see sort of decreasing benefits. We get a little bit more body weight gain, a little bit better, but in all honesty, probably this low treatment group, or 3 1/3 pounds supplement alfalfa, was the right amount for this year. When you look at year 2, you see these cows came in the winter in the same kind of shape, a little over 1,000 pounds, and body condition ranging from 5.2 to roughly 5.3. Same pastures, same cows, but boy, what a difference a year makes. This particular study, we only went 70 days. And we only went 70 days because we're concerned about the body weight and condition loss of these control cows. In 70 days, these cows lost 138 pounds of body weight. It's 2 pounds a day body weight loss with third trimester cows that should be gaining a pound a day. They also lost 2 units of body condition. Similar to year 1, as you go from no supplement to just 2 1/3 pounds or 3 1/3 pounds, we see almost a 90-pound weight gain advantage and over a unit of body condition. The difference between this year, though, is even when you went from low to moderate, you still see a fairly substantial benefit with almost 55 pounds of body weight improvement, and again, close to a unit of body condition score. In this second year, in all honesty, the moderate was probably more ideal for cattle. But again, as you go from moderate to high, you see decreasing benefits. But I think the point is these studies clearly illustrate the importance of meeting their protein needs. But it also illustrates the importance of winter environment, nutrition, how that might affect cow needs and things like that. Some other things that I want you to just think about in terms of just optimal strategic supplementation of grazing cattle in the wintertime is think a little bit about frequency of feeding. A number of researchers have demonstrated that when you actually go to, less frequent feeding, 3 times a week or 2 times a week, you actually get more uniform consumption of the supplement than if you fed it daily. And one way to look at this, if you're feeding, let's say, 3 pounds per day, when you go to 3 times weekly, you're looking at roughly 7 pounds, 7 or 8 pounds, which means those cattle takes them longer to eat it. And some of the cows that might not have got it, their equal amount or appropriate amount in a daily feeding have a better chance of getting some of the supplement in a 3 times basis. All kinds of supplements out there. There's oilseed mills, cottonseed, canola, soybean meal, and in all honesty, as long as you meet their protein needs, I'm not sure if it matters a whole lot what you feed. My favorite protein supplement, I'll be really honest with you, I don't score any points with feed dealers, but my favorite supplement's alfalfa. Okay, alfalfa hay. The exception might be the last 2 years. Alfalfa prices have gotten really high, and we're actually seeing cases here in Montana where sources of protein like canola meal, or wheat midds might be a better deal than alfalfa hay per se. A lot of people talk about timing of supplementation, and generally the recommendation is try to supplement during a time where your cows are not actively grazing. Some of you remember Don Adams, who used to be at our USDA Range Research Station in Fort Keogh, did some work on this and recommended that you supplement during times of the day when the cows aren't actively grazing. So between 0 and 10 o'clock in the morning is a big grazing bout for cattle. So you might consider sometime around midday for supplementing. We could probably spend an entire lecture talking about hand-fed versus self-fed supplements, but hand fed just means the kind of feed you might throw on the back of your truck, alfalfa hay or cottonseed cakes or cubes, and go out and physically deliver it to the cows. Self-fed supplements might be things like protein blocks, molasses, tubs, salt limited feeds, things like that. Pros and cons of either one. And again, invite me back and we talk about the pros and cons of what those would be. I would tell you that most years I recommend, being agreeable to having some level of NPN in your supplement. You can cheapen the cost of the supplement very well, and ruminants by and large can use this. The rule of thumb for urea is it should not exceed 3% of the supplement composition. But just so you know, urea is 287% crude protein. So 3% is roughly about 9 units of crude protein. One of our favorite supplements that we've used here in research at Montana State is a CHS supplement that's 30% crude protein, but 9 of those units, or 3% of that ration, is urea, and that works quite well. So just things to think about. The only thing I caution you about urea is here on the right. You look here. This is a molecule of urea. It's just 2 amine groups attached to a carboxyl group. When urea hits water, it immediately turns into ammonia and carbon dioxide. It's an exothermic reaction. It's actually a cooling effect. But the concern is if you get unusual consumption, for instance, urea in a lick tank, on really, really cold days and water sources freeze, you may have cows go to a lick tank and try to consume that as their source of water. In those kinds of scenarios, ammonia toxicity and things sometimes happen because of overconsumption. So just thing to be aware of, and how you use it, and make sure you don't run into problems that way. And in April, when Dr. Weifels comes in here, he's going to talk about a lot of our research, and we have done a number of projects. I think over the 6 years, we virtually had a winter grazing project at Northern Ag Research Center in Havre. It's almost every year, and the same thing can be said for our Red Bluff Research Station where Noah's at. And generally, a big portion of what we're looking at is what we refer to as strategic supplementation. And essentially, when you hear that term, what we're really trying to get at is we're trying to look at optimal nutrient delivery systems. In other words, how do we get the right amount of supplement to the right cow at the right time? And the truth is, it's not quite as simple as you might think it is. The other thing we're trying to do with our research is how do we encourage optimal use of low quality forages? This picture here is one of our Smart Feed Pro trailers at the Thackeray Ranch, the Northern Ag Research Center. And this is what kind of this rough fescue range looks like in December or January. It's low quality. And so how do we optimize the use, the intake, and digestion of that low quality forage? And then finally, one of the things we're doing that's perhaps different than others, how do we also optimize the use of range? So to tell you a little bit about kind of this research model, and the technology we're using, and like I said, Dr. Weifels will go into this in a lot greater detail. We have this trailer here is basically one of 5 that we have at Montana State University. Each one of these trailers have 4 feeding stations. And so when a cow comes up to this feeding station, it's got an EID reader here on the feed bunk. It reads the cow's number, it timestamps it, and it tells us exactly how much supplement that animal eats. And then it corresponds to each one of these trailers now is equipped with weather stations. So we know what time of day it is. We know what the wind speed is. We know, virtually everything we need to know. And on our cow herds that we do this research, both at Havre as well as Red Bluff, we'll take a percentage, typically 20 to 30% of the cows, and put GPS collars on. So this cow's got a low-tech GPS collar on. We get actual geo fixes once every 5 minutes. It's accurate and roughly about ±3 meters. And inside this collar, we also have an activity monitor that tells us when she's grazing and when she's not grazing. So the long and short of it is we're monitoring beef cattle performance, body weight change, body condition change, how much supplement they eat, grazing behavior, grazing distribution, how they use landscapes. So we're really painting a big picture of just how do we optimize this and how do we do this better, with the goal here of reducing inputs, reducing costs to our ranching industry. Historically, our beef cattle industry, our beef research has a lot of times, we try to control variation. So, we feed cattle in small pens or pens of 6 and things like that. But the reality is most of our ranchers, they run cattle out in extensive rangelands in big groups. And so more and more what we're trying to do for a research model is we may put cattle that range in age from yearling heifers to 14-year-old cows, and then go out and offer them supplement, very extensive environment, and look at individual animal intake, supplement intake, performance. And the goal here is to basically try to do things that's more applied and more meaningful to cow-calf people, because quite frankly, a lot of cases, they put them all in one big group because they may only have one water source during that winter period. The other thing we found out in the last 6 years is that, Montana, has had some really extreme winter weather events. Our winter grazing studies, went through that 2017, 2018, and 2018, 2019 winters. And one of the things I found out was that this is challenging. And here in Montana, the result of those 2 winters was a lot of death loss. I think weak calves, during the calving season, a lot of loss due to scours and things like that. And which is sort of encouraged us to addressing weather patterns, wind chill, and all that's become a big part of all these winter grazing studies. And in fact, what we found out as we've looked through this, most of the models for the influence of environment on beef cattle nutrient requirements are based on a 1981 publication. So if you look down here, National Academy of Press, when they published this, 1981, we're still using those same models. And those models lack a lot of things. They're focused on energy requirements, but they really say little about protein, mineral, and vitamin needs. And I would contend that what we found out just in the last 6 years is that we need protein, mineral, vitamins, as well as energy in terms of how we manage cattle during cold stress. Also, these models primarily relate to temperature and hair coat, but they have limited information with respect to precipitation or wind chill. And in fact, it's shocking to me that wind chill is not part of it. Today here in Bozeman, we're roughly around 0, but with about 20 to 30 mile an hour winds. I can handle 0. Can't deal with the 20, 30 mile an hour winds very well. And I'm pretty sure cows are no different. So we're looking at wind chill equivalents. We're looking at all those things and how do we refine some of these models. So I think in light, like I said, just to summarize what I've said and give us a chance to or you a chance to ask questions. I think to summarize my talk, some final thoughts is, beef cattle were designed historically to utilize low quality forage. That's their giant rumen reticulum, their volumes, things like that. But I think to optimize production, I have people sometimes go, yeah, I really don't believe in supplementing cows. I think we need to just select cows that can do it on their own. Well, the way I always respond to that is if you look at wild ruminants, like bison, even things like Rocky Mountain elk, normal reproductive rates are roughly about 30%. And what that means is on an average year, 30% of that female herd will have a baby. our expectations in the beef industry is 90%. And so to achieve that, we have to help, and so there has to be some supplemental input. It's a balance. You have to, in terms of when do you provide supplements, when do you don't? When do you go ahead and cull a cow because she doesn't fit your environment versus when do you assist with supplemental input? So just things to think about. I think supplemental inputs are essential, particularly with young cows, particularly during, severe, colder than normal winters, which are really hard to predict. So I understand it. I think the goal always is how do we optimize forage use? It doesn't matter if that's green forage in the spring or early summer or that rangeland forage use, and how do we optimize that rumen function? So with that, Noah, I think that kind of wraps up what I had for this group, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Tim, we've got a couple questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see those or if you want me to read them to you.
No, I just pulled it up. So same trend as body condition last study, or was it? Okay. I'm not sure if I understand the question. That's Josh. Josh, can you?
Actually, it's Rick, Dr.
Oh,
Duncan.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was just wondering if those cows were followed through calving and if their calving success trended the same way as their body condition score did in that study, or if maybe that wasn't tracked all the way through calving.
It was tracked, and just so you know, Rick, that's a big part of what we're doing with our Montana State stuff is following through. Those studies I showed you, or the cow studies with Oregon State University, yeah, we followed all that data, and essentially now they refer to it as fetal programming. But we actually saw reduced birth weights in the for the cows that were on the control treatment. In fact, it was about 10 pounds. So we're looking at roughly about 80 pounds for the cows that were supplemented versus like 70. Oddly enough, I had producers get excited about that, but I can tell you, if your feeding and your nutritional status is affecting birth weights, not a good thing. Not a good thing. We also saw depressed reproductive efficiency in those control cows, and those control cows wean calves roughly about 30 to 40 pounds lighter than the supplemented cows. So yeah, we did follow it. Honestly, it's tough to do those studies because even if you have 100 head, that means you only have about 25 treatment. And so the difference between 20 out of 25 getting bred versus 23 out of 25 get bred, affects the numbers, but statistically it's not a lot different. But yeah, we really think there's a lot of benefits to just meeting those protein needs. And it's a big part of what we're doing, really here in the last 4 or 5 years here at Montana State.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I have a question. Do you recommend adding lick tubs or protein blocks to alfalfa? Gosh, yeah, good question. For me, it's I think the lick tubs, protein blocks. One, you have to really track the intake, make sure they're eating what they're supposed to eat. I think they're great for late fall, early winter kind of scenario where you just have a marginal deficiency. And the nice thing about the lick tubs and the protein blocks is you can get a nice trace mineral package put in. But before you go out though and select, these kinds of products because of the trace mineral package, I will also tell you that a legume like alfalfa hay, that's a deep-rooted legume, also provides a really nice mineral package that complements grasses that typically occupies a much shallower portion of the soil profile. So, just things to think about. But we typically, we'll use a tub or a block to a point, but then if we start really having some pretty serious protein deficiency or protein needs, we might go to a hand fed supplement. And one way to look at this, good example would be a third trimester cow, 1,200 pound cow, is going to require roughly about 2.1 pounds of protein per day. If that cow is grazing on native rangelands at 6% crude protein, it's going to eat roughly somewhere between at 2% of body weight. So it's about what you're going to get with this forage base, about 1.4 to 1.5 pounds of protein she'll get from that native rangeland forage. So you're going to have to provide the difference. And so that'd be 0.6 pounds. A 20% alfalfa, you'd be looking at 3 pounds. Okay. A 30% canola-based supplement, you'd be looking at 2 pounds. But that's just meeting her needs. When we start seeing bad weather, things like that, or the forage quality goes down, you have to adjust those needs. Okay. Next question. Any thoughts on improved pasture management to prevent overgrazing? One thing I never talked about, and I probably should have, is complementary forages. One of the alternatives to supplemental input would be providing complementary forages that help bridge some of these nutritional deficiencies. Things like forage kochia and winter rangelands can be very, very beneficial. And part of the challenge we have is if it's just a grass-dominated winter range, they're probably going to be short of protein. But if you throw in some things like forage kochia and things like that, you can meet your needs. And I don't know if I answered all the questions. The improved pasture part. Is that Joe that asked that? Okay, good. So any other questions?
Tim, there's a couple other questions further up in the chat.
Oh, okay. I went past them already. Huh. So can I answer just the ones I want to? Okay, I did that one. How does an operation transition to feeding 4 to 5 months a year to 1 month? Good question. One of the things I will warn you, when I first started out at Oregon State, we started basically a winter grazing program. And the first time you take cows that are used to being fed hay all winter and take them out, wean their calves and then take them back out and tell them they're going to graze again, they might not necessarily thank you. In fact, sometimes they'll follow you. If you're in a flatbed truck that they think they're going to get fed by, they might follow you back to the gate. But typically it sorts itself out pretty darn quick. And we actually made this transition, and Noah is a big part of this here at Montana State. Our beef cow herd, our university herd here historically was a March calving herd. We still tried to winter them as long as we could, but we fed several months with that March calving herd because we'd bring it in and calve them and have to feed them because we kept them in close contact with our barns and our calving facilities. So we transitioned to May calving, and then really since then, and Noah, you can probably speak to this more than I can, but I think one year we fed roughly about a month. Last year we didn't feed at all, and my suspicion is this year we're not going to need to feed at all, barring we don't see any extreme continuation of weather and things like that. But we're doing pretty darn well with that transition. But it's challenging, and you kind of have to sort of tough love, get them switched over. But like you said, I think my observations are is you keep cattle working longer, keep them grazing longer, I think they're actually healthier. And I know herdsmen, both at Oregon State as well as folks here at Montana State, would probably tell you when you keep them out grazing and you're calving out on rangelands, there's some real advantages to that. They just seem to be healthier, less problems in terms of calving difficulties, things like that. So, yeah, let me know, Josh, if that didn't answer your question. I think Tristan asked, any thoughts on oversupplementation in the last trimester, negative effects with calving? I think a lot of these studies we have over supplemented the last trimester, and what you see is really no effect. And so once you meet their protein needs, you feed above that, and essentially they're going to use that excess protein, as an energy source, or it might replace some of the forage they might have ate. But typically, I don't see really negative effects, but I don't see any benefit as you go above what the needs are. Okay. Any questions? If I didn't answer your question, please jump in and ask another question. So, I did get one here, Noah. Question is, what indicators do you recommend to decide when to start supplementation? Really good question. And it's funny, as I get older, I think my answer to that probably changes. I remember years ago, I spent like 2 years doing soft yield collection of cattle, twice a month for 12 months out of the year, just characterizing range forage quality over time with actual cattle diets. And I literally spent, months in the lab, and I did all this stuff. And so I had a poster at the national range meetings, and I'm standing there and I'm really proud of everything I did, but it took an incredible amount of time and work. And this old range professor, and some of you may even know who this was, but Dr. Larry Rittenhouse walked up, and he's looking at it and he goes, "This is all really, really good information." But then he kind of looks at me and he goes, "Well, you need to use my approach to this." I said, "Well, what's that, Dr. Rittenhouse?" And he goes, "If it's green, it's good. If it's brown, it's bad." Okay. And there's some truth to that, actually. So when you look at the fall, if you still have a lot of green in that forage and the cattle seem pretty content, you probably don't need to supplement. But the minute we start getting these Arctic systems come through, you'll see that green disappear really quick. Those plants will translocate nutrients to the crown of the plant, and the above ground biomass becomes very limited. The other thing you can look at is feces. And it sounds a little silly, but you can actually score feces. So, if the cow pie gets high, it's pretty high fiber, low quality. It needs to be supplemented. The cow pie spreads out, not so much. So there's a number of things you can, look at the vegetation, look at the forage. One of the things we found out the last 2 years is pretty remarkable in terms of forage quality of our native rangelands. In all honesty, last year with our Red Bluff Research Center, we had really, pretty severe drought and limited growth during the summer. And then all of a sudden we had 2 precip events, late August, early September, with about an inch of precip. And all of a sudden those native plants greened up. And they grew a little bit, but by the time October came, it stopped again. So we had this vegetative growth that was cut off about October, November. And that's what we did our winter grazing on. That forage was actually quite good. This year we had a really good forage. And a high percentage of those plants went to reproductive stages of plant phenology or maturity. And in all honesty, we got a lot of feed out of Red Bluff. But it's not very good. And so, I think just those differences in forage seasons, forage years affect, how much supplement you need. So it's fairly dynamic. A lot of things you need to think about.
And with that, we are just out of time. So thank you, Tim, for coming and presenting to us. We really appreciate the time. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening.
All right, thanks, guys. Thank you.